Good evening, marhaban, 大家好, to everyone who is joining us today from around the world. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Culture and History panel of the China Gulf Forum 2021. My name is Yuting, and I'm from the forum's Speakers Relation Committee. I will be the facilitator for this panel. We are sincerely grateful to the support of our distinguished, outstanding speakers with us today for sharing their expertise with us, scholars, young professionals, and students from all over. The panel will start with a moderated discussion, then followed by a Q&A session. Please feel free to send your questions anonymously to the Q&A box throughout the panel, and our moderator will go over them one by one during the Q&A session. The panel will be around 75 minutes long. This panel will look into Sino-Middle Eastern interactions from a cultural and historical lens. Topics include cultural identity, formation and evolution of the cultural ties between these two regions, the contribution of Muslim intellectuals, and the impact of Belt and Road Initiative in the 21st century. Please allow me to introduce our distinguished panelists and our moderator for the session. We have invited 4 remarkable panelists and 1 moderator to join us today. Our first panelist is Dr. Guilhem André. As an archaeologist and art historian, Dr. André currently serves as Chief Curator at Louvre, Abu Dhabi, in charge of the medieval and Asian arts. He is particularly involved in creating museums collection. Prior to this assignment, he had established a number of scientific and cultural programming of Asian arts. Dr. André began his career at the Musée des Arts Asiatiques Guilhem, where he actively participated in numerous exhibitions in Europe, Asia, and the Gulf. In France, he created the chair of art history of the Far East at l'Institut Catholique de Paris and chaired the program of Far Eastern Arts at l'École du Louvre. Our second panelist is Dr. Ben-Dor Benite. Dr. Benite is professor of Chinese history and of Middle Eastern and Islamic studies at New York University. He studied in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Shandong University in Jinan, and received his PhD in history from UCLA in 2000. His main area of interest is the interaction between religion, trade, science, and politics in Asia and Indian Ocean history. He is the author of The Tao of Muhammad, A Cultural History of Muslims in Late Imperial China, of The 10 Lost Tribes, A World History, and co-editor of Modern Middle Eastern Jewish Thought, Writings on Identity, Culture, and Politics. Our third panelist is Dr. Shiren Ding. Dr. Ding is a professor at Lanzhou University, specializing in the field of Islamic studies. He is the founder and director of Institute of Islamic Culture Studies at Lanzhou University, the president of the Association for Minority Culture and Education Promotion for Gansu Province, and the founder and editor-in-chief of Islamic Culture Studies. Dr. Ding received his PhD in Comparative Religions from Harvard University in 2003. He is the author of The Science of Hadith, and his current research project is to excavate, rescue, and collect Chinese Islamic literature. Our fourth speaker is Dr. Yuting Wang. Dr. Wang is Associate Professor of Sociology at the American University of Sharjah in the UAE and non-resident research fellow in the Center on Religion and the Global East at Purdue University. She has held numerous visiting positions, including at Northwestern University and UC Berkeley. She has published widely on Islam and Muslims in China, transnational religious networks, social changes in the Arabian Gulf, Chinese expatriates community in the UAE, and Sino-UAE relations in the era of Belt and Road. She is the author of Between Islam and the American Dream, an immigrant Muslim community in post-9/11 America, and Chinese in Dubai, Money, Pride, and Soul Searching. And last but not least, I would like to introduce the moderator of the panel, Dr. Shuang. Dr. Wen is a historian of modern China and Arab world. Prior to joining NYU Shanghai, Dr. Wen held fellowships at the National University of Singapore and New York University Abu Dhabi. She received a PhD in Transregional History, Modern Middle East and East Asia from Georgetown University in the US, and an MA in Middle East Studies from American University in Cairo in Egypt. As a native Mandarin speaker, she received additional intensive Arabic language training from the University of Damascus and Middlebury. Her research has been featured by the American Historical Association. Thank you, Dr. Wen, for joining us and for moderating the panel today. And now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yuting. It is a great pleasure to moderate this panel because I'm very familiar with our panelists. I read Zevi's book, and I now teach in my class with your books and also articles. Also, I have known Yuting Wang since I was working in Abu Dhabi, and congratulations on your new book. Dr. Ding, Zevi also read your book, so this is another generation of intellectual genealogy. And Dr. André, although we never had the chance to meet each other in person, when I was holding the fellowship at NYU Abu Dhabi, I took my students to Louvre in Abu Dhabi many times. So it is really a great pleasure to be able to moderate this session on the cultural and historical ties between China and the Islamic world. I know in our audience, we have a lot of young scholars and aspiring students who want to study the interactions between China and the Islamic world. Maybe to provide some background knowledge, some of you can provide some major milestones about the phases of how Islam come to China. Zevi, for example, in my class, I use your article, Follow the White Camels, about the 4 stages of Islam coming to China. Any panelists would like to share about this background information for our young and aspiring students?
Should I respond to this right now?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
So, thinking about the following the white camel, I mean, I think it's an emblem for Chinese Islamic identity, and I borrowed this metaphor from a story of a Muslim community in Shanghai, where they say that, you know, according to the legend, they said that they were fleeing a tyrant in the area of Samarkand, and they didn't know where to go. So what they did is they put a Quran on the head of a camel, and they said, we'll follow the camel, and we will go where the camel leads us. And the camel, of course, leads them to China. Okay, this is a beautiful story because, in fact, it is a reworking of the famous story of how, you know, when the Prophet Muhammad came to Medina, you know, he followed his own white camel to the place where, you know, and the white camel led him to the place where he created his mosque, you know, the first mosque in Medina, which is the first mosque, in fact, of the Ummah. Yes. Now, why do Chinese Muslims, you know, use tales like that? It is a way of, you know, reconciling the fact that on one hand, they are at home in China, and on the other hand, China is not, at least officially, Dar al-Islam, you know, like part of the Islamic world. So this is part of a much longer, much richer spectrum of stories that are designed basically to justify, legitimate, explain, but also make China a home for Muslims and reflect that in their identities and biographies.
Any other panelists who would like to share some of the background information to our students audience about any particular phase of Islamic connections with China of your research interest?
Okay, let me talk something about Islam or entry of Islam in China. As we know, the relationship between China and the Islamic world can be traced back to 7th century when the first delegation of Muslim came to China and visited visited the court of emperor. So the year of 651 marked the entry of Islam into China, as the first Arab delegation reached the Chinese court and met the emperor. The event was registered in official record, which marks the official entry of Islam into China. So I think this event is very important in the history of Islam or Muslim in China.
Yuting, would you like to share? And then Dr. André, would you like to add something too?
Hello, everyone. It is really wonderful to have the opportunity to have this conversation with so many distinguished scholars, and especially Dr. Zivi. Your book, The Prophet Muhammad, was one of the first books that was introduced when I reached the US as a graduate student in sociology. I got interested in sociology of religion. It was 2001. So it was really a prime time to study Islam. And then I got interested in Islam in China as well. But my research was primarily actually on contemporary Muslim communities in China. And I also actually became interested in the transnational network that has been maintained by these very mobile entrepreneurs from China and to Southeast Asia, to the Middle East and other parts of the world. So I think when we talk about these important phases of developments in Islam in China and Chinese Muslims, I think it's important to look at post-reform or the reform era China and how that has affected the Chinese Muslims. And then we look at the heritage, and we know that the identity is a big topic in the study of Islam in China and Chinese Muslims. And the reform has actually opened up the door again and to help the Chinese community to reconnect with a global Muslim ummah. And so that was actually what I think would be something very important and very interesting, and to explore that transnational dimension that has been reestablished because of reopening China to the world.
Dr. André, would you like to add something? Please, Dr. André, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Yes, thank you. I wanted to share something about the facts and the main facts and the chronology of the relationship between the Islamic and Chinese worlds. As you know, I'm in the background of art and material culture, and naturally there is one area of artistic production which is particularly fertile for the study of historical links between the Islamic world and China, and which probably should be mentioned is the field of ceramics. In focusing on ceramics as a main testimony of cultural exchange may be surprising for some of our for persons from our audience, but since today the ceramics are everyday objects, but this was not at all the case in ancient times, when many types of ceramics, stoneware or porcelain, were truly luxury products subject to international trade for more than 1 millennium. One of the peculiarities of this material is that despite its relative fragility, it can be transported well and kept for centuries, sometimes complete or in the form of shards, which in any case provide a great deal of information on techniques, commercial networks, commissions, etc. It allows understanding many details about exchange and trade between these two cultures, and enables setting up quite clear chronology. And we can define approximately 4 main steps that seems to to be relevant to the history of the Sino-Islamic exchange, as reflected by the discoveries of ceramics. The first period is, of course, starting with the Islamic conquest of the 7th century and can be seen as a turning point in the history of the Indian Ocean. Navigators from the Arabian Gulf reached the Chinese seas for the first time. It was also during this period that direct trade between the Gulf and China was described by Arabic geographers as well as Chinese authors. And it reflects the new strategy for foreign trade implemented in order to offset the loss of control of overland routes after the famous An-Lushan rebellion from the Tang Dynasty. As a testimony, of course, we have plenty, but one of the main is the cargo that was found in Indonesia on the Belitung shipwreck, which was a traditional Arab dough that sank in the 820s. It's probably the best example as stoneware with bronze painting decorations from the kilns of Changsha in Hunan were featured prominently with around 55,000 pieces that were counted during the excavation. There were also other shapes of ceramics, in particular the sansai, that were to be copied also in the Islamic world. And these ceramics are concentrated in the Gulf, especially in Siraf and Sohar. So we have this direct testimony of the trade and relationship between the two worlds, arriving in the Gulf at this port. The second period opens at the 10th century with the weakening of the Abbasid central power on one side and the economic emergence of China and India on the other side. Direct voyages between the Gulf and China were replaced by a kind of spatial segmentation of the trade networks. Nankhan and Wuyue kingdoms and finally the Song dynasty emerged as maritime powers, and Chinese junks were sailing until India. And then for its part, the Gulf had its own commercial network. At the time, there was mainly monochrome pieces that were traded, such as green glazed stoneware from Zhejiang, the Yue, of course, the Qingpai, the bluish-white stoneware, which were predominant until the 14th century, as well as the porcelain stoneware from lesser quality that were spread all around Southeast Asia later on. And this is also the period where during the 11th and 12th century, there was a relative decline of Siraf, while the city-states such as Shiraz in Persia were emerging. So this second period, also particularly important. The third one is probably more famous after 1330s. And during the 15th century, when the blue and white porcelain appeared in the major manufacturers of the region, and the archive sources, as well as the analysis, both confirm that the first blue and white wares were made using cobalt from Kashan in Persia and imported by Muslim merchants who were living in Lanzhou. Of course, we all know that the blue cobalt was used a long time ago, before the 14th century, but it was at this time highly appreciated and very refined production that was done in Qingdezhen. Then the Mongol exported as far as the Gulf and the Red Sea and onto the Mediterranean and East Africa, this production. Of course, the pieces were featuring a very high level of dexterity and also copying Islamic pieces in other materials such as brass. The last period is sometimes called the Portuguese period, and it starts with the conquest of Hormuz and several other cities of the Gulf. Their power was fragile, and they contented themselves with kind of indirect control on the other parts of the Gulf, and they were backed up by alliances with the local powers. In the mid-16th century, blue and white from Qingdezhen was almost the only ceramic that was still imported, with the exception of a small quantity of monochromes, white, blue, or yellow. the markets of the Muslim world still drove the Chinese porcelain industry, and special orders were common at this period, notably for objects that were decorated with inscriptions in Arabic or in Persian, imitating again Islamic pieces. And we have beautiful example of this kind into our gallery, in the first gallery of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, actually. The beautiful whiteware which was mounted in the 18th century with bronze mountings in France. On a global scale, the Portuguese managed not only to put an end to the European notion of the Orient as a supplier of Asian and African luxury objects, but they also asserted themselves as the essential intermediaries for these goods in the Indo-Pacific space. So this is a story that is deducted from the discoveries on the field, but which is key to understand the periodization and relationships, copies, interactions, dynamics between these two worlds. And it allows, after all these years of discoveries, to have a quite clear chronology of the facts. But maybe from the intellectual world, you have also such a chronology that was built. In museums, of course, we are using mainly the material culture.
Yes, the objects, a lot of the ceramics.
Indeed.
And yes, thank you very much for this very comprehensive chronology. And now the student audience probably already know that the connections between China and the Islamic world can date back to the Tang Dynasty, and then all the way through the Song and Mongol rule of the Yuan China and trade along the Indian Oceans. So my next question to our panelists are your particular current research.
Professor Wen,
yes?
Just a moment. I want to add one point more.
Yes, please.
Okay. So about the entry of Islam into China or relationship between China and Islamic world, I want to add something more. The Mongol Empire emerged in the 13th century by a series of conquests and invasions throughout Central Asia and Western Asia, reaching Eastern Europe. As the conquest expanded, they need more soldiers, so they recruit many soldiers from Central Asia. In China, Central Asia, in China, Mongols had established the Yuan dynasty for expanding more territory and ruling the country. They need troops and all kind of men who can play some rules for Mongols' domination. Therefore, they brought a huge number of soldiers, scholars, and talented people from Central Asia to China. So this increased the number of Muslims in China.
Yes, indeed. Especially during the Mongol rule of China, the Muslims in China, Muslims either from Central Asia or other parts of the world, even hold higher social status than the Han Chinese because of their scientific and technological expertise to the Mongol court. So my next question to the panelists, in your research on the China-Islamic interactions, are there any particular group of actors or scholars, scientists that you are currently working on, would like to share more about this particular group of people, be it scientists, astronomers, Zivi in your case, or Sufi scholars, Dr. Ding in your case, or Muslim entrepreneurs in Yuting's case? Would you like to share with our audience a little bit more?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, Professor D.
Please,
Go
please.
ahead.
You please, please.
No, please.
No, you please.
Okay. One of the things that is very, very important, and we should begin maybe from the middle and go back and then go into the future. If you look at the early Ming, and you read the Ming Shi, you will find many references to the fact that Zhu Yuanzhang, the founder of the Ming Dynasty, ordered the translation of a lot of astronomy works. And we also see that the Bureau of Translation and Bureau of Interpretation in the court are growing in numbers exponentially. And they produce a lot of dictionaries and a lot of translation books, and they also produce a lot of translations. The main thing that they do is, first of all, astronomy, then geography, and then medicine. And I'm going to be very, very quick about these three things. If you go back to the Sung period, you will find out that the knowledge that the Chinese require from Muslims and Arabs, many of them, by the way, come from the Gulf, as we heard from Professor Guilhem. One of the things that you see is that they have a lot of geographical knowledge about the western parts of the Indian Ocean, which begin to be translated into Chinese in the Sung period and are coded in a book which is called the Jufanzhi. You know, it's like, in other words, the knowledge of the Indian Ocean. That geography is not updated until the Yongle period, again by Muslims, but this time Chinese Muslims under the Zhenghe expedition, you know, particularly Ma Huan's book, okay, which is an update to an earlier book. So this is in terms of geography. In the early Ming period, you also have other geographies of Asia that are based on Islamic knowledge, which is coming to the period which is basically translated into Chinese. So that's geography. Astronomy, very, very important. We have evidence that already from the early Sung period, astronomers coming to China because they have superior math and particularly geometric information that the Chinese need. Now, this is not new, okay? Not a new practice. I mean, already from already after the Han Dynasty, China has adopted Indian models of the cosmos, Indian models of understanding and calendar making and understanding celestial motions, you know. So when Islam rises, it is only natural that they turn to Islamic knowledge and adopt that as well. Just by way of comparison, every time that something like this happens in Europe, for example, with Galileo and Copernicus, we call it a scientific revolution, okay? In China, you had several of those even before that. And one of the things that happens is exactly that. So we have evidence already in the Sungshi that you have Muslim astronomers coming to participate in the court and do that. Later on, and now I'm coming back to the Ming Dynasty. Right after a lot of Muslim astronomers come from Iran mostly, but also from elsewhere in the Arab world, to China to work as astronomers, and they build the observatory of the Yuan Dynasty in Beijing, which exists until today, and they bring a lot of machinery and a lot of information, you know, for that. But when the Ming Dynasty rises, China moves from Persian and Arabic, yes, to Chinese. And all of this information needs to be translated. And these astronomers actually begin to work as translators as well as interpreters of this knowledge. And the Bureau of Astronomy at the court is half Chinese, half Muslim for a very, very long time, all the way to the 17th century, to the Kangxi period. So if you look at what the Bureau of Translation they're doing, they're translating a lot of astronomy. If you open the first page, I'm not going to show slides, it's too complicated, but the first page will have, you know, will be Tianwen men, you know, basically astronomy. And the first words will be Nur, in Arabic, light, and then translation into this Guang. And then later on, the Persian word Roshan. And right after that, it would say Ming, which I think is a little bit deliberate that they begin with these two words, you know, which are central, of course, to early Ming ideology. Okay. Now, all of that knowledge at some point becomes outdated, but it is not completely gone. Even though it is outdated, it becomes actually part of the heritage of the Chinese Islamic community in China. Because when the Han Kitab scholars rise in the 17th and 18th century, they turn it into part of what they call their own heritage. Even though this science is no longer used, it is part of the Islamic identity, the Chinese Islamic identity of these people, particularly Liu Zhi and others who basically take it as a form of pride. Final point on that, if you look at family genealogies of a lot of Muslims in China, they will say, and sometimes it's not true, yes, they will say, our ancestors came from the Western regions in order to work on the Chinese calendar. Yes. Now, we cannot assume that every Muslim in China, you know, is a descendant of astronomer, but the point is that many say that they were, because it's actually it's a form of pride and becomes part of their heritage, and it is very, very important. The same thing happens with medicine. One of the most important translations at that period, in the early Ming period, is the Hui Hui Yaofang, which is basically a translation of Ibn Sina's Qanun fi Tib, which is a very, very important pharmacological science work that is becoming, again, a point of elaboration and translation, etc., etc., etc. Okay. Now, yeah, I can show that slide. Let me see how I can do the share screen, right? I don't know if you can see my screen. Yes, there you are. That's the bit I'm talking about. Okay, so let me finish just with the medicine. The medicine is crucial because it actually preserves a lot of Greek medicine from particularly Galenus and others that became part of Islamic medicine in the medieval period in West Asia and the Mediterranean, then came to China with Muslims who came mostly with the Mongols, and then was translated into Chinese, yes, and became in fact part of what we call the Chinese materia medica. Okay, it's a very, very interesting trajectory from ancient Greece to the Islamic world, and from the Islamic world to China, to Chinese. But the point is that it also becomes part of the heritage of the Chinese Muslims. I'm now working on a book on Islamic science in the early Ming in China, which is a very, very dramatic moment. And it is very important that we remember this, particularly these days. You know, the scientific contribution to the rise of the early Ming, which is a moment of China's comeback after 150 years of occupation, yes, is crucial and very, very important, despite the fact that, you know, the numbers are relatively small because the Chinese nation is very big.
Next one, Dr. Dean, would you like to share about your major research interest on the Sufi scholars, Sufi literature?
Yes. Actually, I'm interested in Sufism in China and the relation based on the Sufism. Sufism has been a very popular phenomena in northwest China, but we know Sufism not a local production. It is introduced from outside, especially from Persia, from Central Asia, and India. Now, I'd like to mention some important figures and literatures that have shaped this relationship. Okay, please. First one. Okay, there was a very important personal figure, Ahmed Kassani, who was known as Makhtoum Azam. He was believed to be 21st generation of Prophet Muhammad's offspring. So he was from Holy Family, and he was a disciple of a great Sufi master of Central Asia named Ubaidullahi Ahrar. Ahmed Kassani had continuous influence on China through his disciples and the children. The most important one is his son, Ishaq Wali, in the 16th century, who came to China and established a Sufi center in Kashgar and spread Naqshbandi at first in Xinjiang, then in northwest China. So the Ahmed Kassani is the very important figure in Sufism in China. And the second one is Khwaja Abdullah. he was the first man who introduced the Qadri Sufi order in northwest China. Still, there are some Menghuan in Gansu, Shanxi, Sichuan province following his order. And Khwaja Abdullah came either from Medina or from somewhere of Persia. The second one, and the third one is Muhyiddin. We don't know exactly what was his name, but in the 18th century he came to China and introduced the Kubriya to northwest China. Still, there are some Menghuan in Gansu following his order, and he was believed to come from Baghdad. And the fourth one is Shah Auliya from Badakhshan of Afghanistan. He was the first person who introduced the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi, not only Naqshbandi, but Naqshbandi Mujaddidi into China. And he established a Sufi center in Yarkand of Xinjiang, and his disciples spread his order in Gansu, Ningxia, and Qinghai province. I think these are foreign masters who had made strong connection with China. And there were also some Chinese Sufi masters who had played an important role in bridging China and the Islamic world. There are two very important personals should not be neglected. The first one is Ma Leichi. He is a Chinese Sufi master who went to Hajj and studied in Mecca for 3 years and obtained ijazah from a Naqshbandi Sufi master Ahmad ibn Aqil al-Makki. Then he came back and established the Huasi Menghuan in Gansu province and continued his master's order, which is known as Hufiyya in China. Later on, another Sufi master named Ma Mingxing came back from his learning in Yemen, and he preached another Naqshbandi order called Jahriya. And Ma Mingxing went to Hajj when he was 9 years old with his uncle. But unfortunately, his uncle missed in a storm. Ma Mingxing was fortunately survived and brought by someone to Central Asia near China's border. He lived there for some years and practiced Sufism in Khanqa. It was said that later on he performed Hajj and learned Naqshbandi order from Yemen. Then he came back to China and established the Jahriya Sufi order in Gansu and Ningxia province. So above mentioned are some important figures who bridge China and Islamic world together. And there are still some books, literature, which strengthened this connection, such as I select some very important one. Lawamia, first one, Lawamia. It is the Sufi philosophical work talking about union with God and immortality, and also separation and union. The book was written by Persian Sufi master Abdul Rahman Jami. He is well known Sufi in the Sufi circle. And the second book is Lawaih. It is also philosophical work talking about Wahdat al-Wujud, oneness of being, and the stage of God's appearance. The book is also written by Persian Sufi master Abdul Rahman Jami. And the third one is important literature is Lama'at and Ashat Lama'at. Lama'at is a philosophical work talking about 22 stages of God's appearance from his oneness to universe. Of course, the idea was influenced by Ibn Arabi. The book was written by Persian Sufi philosopher Fakhruddin Ibrahim. And again, this book was commented by Abdurrahman Jami, named Ash'atul Lama'at. Another very important work is the Maktubat. Maktubat is very, very popular work in China. It is collection, of course, it is collection of letters and correspondences between Ahmad Sarhandi and his disciples. And they ask questions and given answers. It mainly deals with the wahdat al-wujud, oneness of being, and the wahdat al-shuhud, oneness of creature. The book was written by Indian Naqshbandi master Ahmad Sarhandi. So I think these figures and literatures have shaped the Sino-Islamic relationship. Thank you.
Yuting.
Hi. No, thank you so much, Dr. Ding and Dr. Zivi, for giving us such a profound overview of the connection between China and Islamic world through science, art, and literature. And I would like to talk a little bit more about trade and commerce. And we know that the connection between China and the Middle East and then the other, the Central Asian region has been sustained by this continuous trade through ancient Silk Road. I'm not going to talk so much about ancient trade, and I'm going to talk more about my own research on contemporary Chinese Muslim entrepreneurs. And we know that when we talk about entrepreneurs, and they are definitely different from these small traders and merchants who have been traveling within China and then the Middle East, and then now the Muslims in China have traditionally played the role of middleman minority in many cases. So back in 2006, when I was still in graduate school, I had an opportunity to study the relationship between faith and trust and in enterprises in this rising market economy in China. So I went back to China to do some field work, and then actually it was really an eye-opening experience for me as someone who was new to study Islam in China. So I traveled to Beijing and then went to Zhengzhou and down to Guangzhou, and actually had encountered many interesting individuals and who have been really trying to actually maintain this very strong identity in this rising, emerging market economy in China. They're Muslims and the minorities, and then they're actually in some of these niche markets that are traditionally dominated by Muslims. And for example, we have these jade makers, and or in the trade of jewelry, and then we have these factories and these manufacturers, and who are in the shoe business, and then so that sort of continued the tradition of these sort of trade and in a Muslim community and the restaurant and so on. But I also actually encountered some of these entrepreneurs who are young, educated, and they're the new generation of Chinese Muslims, and they're really trying to find their own position in this rapidly changing society. For example, in Guangzhou, I met these fashion designers, and who have created stylish hijab and then abaya Islam dresses with a mixture of cultural elements that they draw from different parts of the world, and then also trying to integrate with the Chinese tradition. And they have actually entered the garment industry, for example, create factories, and then some of them engage in trade, using their linguistic advantage and to establish that kind of connections between China and the Middle East. And then some of those actually enter tourism, the booming tourism tourist industry. And in Nanjing, I met artists, the mural art studio, for example, and that is growing there. They customize fine art pieces and paintings and murals, and so they contribute to the beautification project that is actually going very successfully in the city and surrounding areas. And they do commercial projects. They also do charity projects, and they're really sort of engaging in a way and to exert their own influence. This is sort of a civic engagement that we're talking about in China. It's at the beginning stage, but then you can tell that they're really trying and to make a statement as Muslim minorities and professionals. And then you also have IT specialists and then pharmaceutical startups and then the research facilities as well. So it's really, really diverse. And then in Dubai, actually, I've spent the last 12 years working and living in the Middle East, and then it was actually very interesting to observe how Muslim entrepreneurs have sort of really expanded into this region. Yes, primarily they're small traders, merchants, but then you also see some of them really creating their enterprises. For example, medicine. Dr. Zivi mentioned, medical knowledge of the Muslims are actually quite important in ancient China. And now some of these medical practitioners from China, they're from the Muslim background, and they came here. They brought this, Chinese Islamic medical heritage back to the Middle East, and then trying to reconnect with the Arab society. And so there is one actually good example in Dragon Mart 2. And then they're really exerting their identity as Chinese Muslims. And then so they practice this way medicine. They're actually providing some very interesting alternatives to treat diabetes, and some of these diseases that really troubles people here in the Arab society, acupuncture, obviously, but then they try to engage a conversation that, it's understandable and to the local, not just from the Chinese medical perspective, but really sort of communicate that Chinese Islamic heritage there. It's very innovative, but also very true to that heritage. And then we have people who are in this very sort of avant-garde kind of business in Islamic finance, blockchain, cryptocurrency. And this is something very new and it's also very controversial. They talk about whether this is halal or not, and this is still being debated about. But we can see some of these pioneers actually going into the field, so they're not on the margins of the world of trade and business anymore. They're trying to enter the mainstream, and we have those media startups as well. There's some of those actually I could call. I could refer them as social entrepreneurs. Probably they really do not care so much about profit. They care more about solving social problems and trying to make a really important contribution as Chinese Muslims in the Middle East, and so they are engaged in offering educational services, provide consultations. They will go into Syria, for example, to its refugee camps. They do actually run some sort of business project on the side, but then they're also primarily thinking about how to engage with charity organizations here in the region. So you have a huge variety of enterprises going on here. This is a new generation of Chinese Muslims, and then they are small in number. But I think they're actually quite important, right? Because they have this cultural capital, social capital that they are using actually to reconnect with the Middle East, with other, not just ours, but also this international Muslim Ummah here in the UAE, and using Dubai as this global city, as a knot on this expanding global network. And so this these Muslims actually in the Middle East are not just isolated; they're also very much connected to those in Southeast Asia, especially Malaysia, Indonesia, and for example, Southern California as well. And we have a actually fairly large Chinese Muslim community in Southern California. So some of those actual descendants of these the family of Ma Honghui, for example, who went on exile in California, later on died in Los Angeles. And so, you know, some of these connections have been established by these earlier generation of migrants, but then their younger ones, their descendants are still maintaining that. They're quite mobile. So they're actually seeking out different ways to participate. And now, you know, this is very, very exciting. But I think, you know, really, if you look at this, and I think we really have to think about, you know, to what extent they are visible in this growing Chinese transnational business network. Yes, there are many of them trying to do different things, but they're still very small. But we can see some examples where Chinese Muslim business people, entrepreneurs, are really trying to actually make a growing impact, and then they become much, much more visible. For example, in Ningxia, we have this this entrepreneur who invested or actually you know, brought a lot of investments into Ningxia, and then, you know, talking about healthcare city, whether that's materialized or not, but then they're trying to do big projects. So I think these are the new things, and then I have observed in my research, and then with these new directions and that the Chinese Muslims are moving toward, and together with these kind of rich heritage that then they have established in, you know, in their encountering with you know, with the Chinese and others in this very broad region, I think this is going to be something very exciting for young scholars, and then who are paying attention to China-Middle East relations. And there's a historical heritage there, and the cultural heritage, and there's also some of this new trend, especially I think blockchain, Islamic finance is going to be a sort of exciting field for research.
Thanks, Yuting. My next set of questions, it's going to excite our young audience. It is your anecdotes of studying in China and the Islamic world, and devoting your academic career into studying the connections between these two worlds. Building on what Yuting just mentioned, I can share one of my best Egyptian girlfriends met her Chinese husband actually in Dubai, who was a Chinese Muslim practicing medicine in Dubai. And they just building on the case that Yuting mentioned about among these Chinese Muslims who are now moving back to the Middle East, either bringing their own medical knowledge or some other social entrepreneurial responsibilities. But it really happened in my own personal interactions. In the end, this Egyptian girl, Muslim woman, married a Chinese Muslim man. They met in Dubai, and she is now pursuing her PhD study in Islamic philosophy in China. Anyways, my next set of questions is related to the anecdotes that will excite our young audience. We all know it's not easy to study the interactions between China and the Islamic world because of the language barrier, and you guys are all writing in English. It is very difficult to study in China, Israel, Pakistan, working in Abu Dhabi, Sharjah, and the US as well. Would you like to share some of the anecdotes you had in your early careers, and also what is driving you, keeping you motivated to continue to work on this quite challenging but very important and understudied topic?
Well, I can begin by basically two anecdotes that have to do with actually with the fact that, you know, I arrived in this topic by a complete accident. I was one of the first people to come from Israel to study in China. This was like 30 years ago, and I was in Shanghai. And the only thing that I was worried about at that time is places where I couldn't eat pork. So I used to go to the local mosque and sit down and have you know, and have also food. Now, at that time, today, when you go to China and you meet in the mosque, you meet the local imam. The imam is fluent in Arabic because people in the past 30 years have been going to the Middle East, and their Arabic is amazing. But at that time, it wasn't like this, and most of the imams were actually much older people. And in Nanjing and in other places where I used to go, I always arrived at the mosque to find a place to eat. And the imam would say, "Are you Muslim?" Which is a very legitimate question, given the way I look and my accent. And my answer was always, chabudo. I don't eat pork, in fact, Jewish law and Islamic law are very similar, particularly when it comes to dietary law. And they always used to saying is like, okay, well, let's read the Quran together so you can, because we want to hear it, how it sounds, from someone who's native in Arabic. Now, my family originates in Iraq, and Arabic is, the first language that I spoke. I also grew up in Jerusalem, which is a binational city with, at least almost 40% of the people are Palestinian. So this was like my first thing. But actually, I was working on labor history of China. I wasn't working on Islam. Later on, when I became a scholar of Islam in China, I came back to China to give a talk at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in the Islamic section. And we had lunch with the people there. And I had a funny thing with Professor Feng Yuan, who is, of course, very, very important, very famous. And he said to me, my ancestors, he didn't say my ancestors. He says, he said my family came to China all the way from Baghdad. And I said to him, oh, my family also came from Baghdad. Now, I meant that my parents came from Baghdad. And he spoke about it as if it happened yesterday. And then I said, like, well, who's your family? And then he mentioned, the General Feng, who was like with Zhu Zhang, And I said to him, that was 700 years ago. And you talk about it as if it was yesterday. And he said, yeah, that's the tradition that runs in my family, that this was going on. And this was a very interesting illustration for me to the idea that, family genealogy is always remembered, not the first ancestor in the Islamic land, not the first ancestor who was born in China, but the one who made the migration. Okay. In other words, the founder of the genealogy is the one who migrated, not the one who was like the ancient clan in Arabia, not the one who was like border or in China. It's always the migrant. It's like the first important person, and it is always like an ongoing moment. I'm working also on the Ding family, genealogy, and I think you can see this the same. You can say the same thing. So this is by way of anecdote, But for me, it was mostly, the idea. Like Ibn Battuta used to come to China, and he writes, "I go to places, because I'm afraid of pork. Everything is pork here." So it was the same thing for me.
This is first time I hear about this anecdote, but building on that, when I was studying in Egypt, I was always looking for tofu. I'm not a Muslim and living in the Islamic country. I grew up eating soy food. Anyways, I don't want to take the time of our panelists. What about other panelists would like to share some anecdotes?
Yes. I have some anecdotes, but my anecdote is not a love story. I want to tell another story. I studied in Pakistan for a long time, and I personally witnessed this kind of relationship during my stay in Pakistan. Generally, Pakistani people are very, very friendly to Chinese people, and they love Chinese and respect Chinese. And as it is said, that our relationship between two nations, as long as Indus River and as high as Himalaya mountain. But if someone knows you are Muslim, he would become more happy and delighted and willing to help you in any form and solve your all problems. So once a Chinese came to Pakistan, he wanted to perform Hajj through Pakistan. And in his journey, he brought some white cap to Pakistan. He wanted to sell it, and after selling his good, he wanted to go Hajj. So I went to market with him as a translator, and he told a shopkeeper what he wanted. As soon as the shopkeeper knew his story, the shopkeeper immediately picked up his caps and distributed among shopkeepers in the market. Although they were not dealing in the cap business, but he distributed and sold it immediately. So they did so just to help Chinese Muslim. So I think it is a very interesting story, and indicates the relationship between Chinese Muslim and Muslim in other Islamic world. Thank you.
Dr. André, would you like to share some anecdotes while working in Abu Dhabi? Your mic?
Yeah, it doesn't come to my mind any kind of story that I could tell now. But if it comes to my mind later, then I won't hesitate.
Okay. Yuting?
Yeah. Well, yes, anecdotes. Actually, probably just some stories, and I think maybe some of students will find interesting, because I grew up in China, of course, and I never actually paid attention to religion. It's very similar to those who were born in the 1980s, and I actually encountered Islam in the United States. In 2001, I arrived 32 days actually prior to the tragic events of September 11th. It was a ordinary day, but in the morning I actually slept in, and then my friends start calling from Beijing, from other parts of the world, because they felt like I was so close to the epicenter, but I was very far. I was in Illinois. That just sort of a moment that I began looking at a religion that was so far from me, very, very unfamiliar, completely strange even. But it was actually very interesting to get to know Muslim students, friends in the US on the university campus, who were actually affected so deeply by this event. And it was actually after that I became interested in Islam, and also had opportunity to study Muslims. And so that was actually my dissertation, my PhD dissertation. I studied American Muslims, immigrant Muslims in particular. And I was very interested actually in this very dynamic community they're building in suburb United States. And especially, it was actually a university town where you have relatively homogeneous sort of, Muslim group, and then mostly, highly educated. But then in the years after 9/11, we also start receiving refugees from Africa, from other parts of the world. So we start seeing this, social, and this increasingly diverse community as well in terms of social class, right? In terms of their experiences as immigrants. And then we also have this indigenous African American community who have actually been in the city for a very long time, since the 1930s, 1940s. And so it was actually a very interesting place to look very closely at how, different groups of Muslims from different parts of the world, and then all gathered in the United States, and in that decade after 9/11. So that was beginning of my whole journey to study Muslim, to study Islam. But my work actually on Chinese Islam or Chinese Muslims actually started 2006, like I mentioned earlier. It was a particular project that brought me back to China to look at faith and trust and in this emerging market economy. And because of my research on Islam in the United States, and then so I was entrusted with a task conducting research, fieldwork on Chinese Muslims. And then I start writing about Chinese Muslim entrepreneurs and then start paying attention. So I think, for young scholars who are into the field, and I think, to study Chinese Muslims, especially contemporary Chinese Muslims, and you have to be willing to travel, not just geographically to travel, because it's actually a very broad social network. And now they are in many different parts of the world, and also, to travel culturally and to sort of, be brave and to enter this very, very new and very unfamiliar territory. So that was actually how I got into this, and then how I continue to do research. And so I've been in the UAE for a decade, more than a decade now. My research actually has allowed me to travel to many places, and then to really sort of get to see this broadening social network. And then so we see that kind of going back and forth actually in Chinese Muslim communities. And then so in Southern California, I met people there. And then I went to Nanjing. Actually, I met, I met people who has a family actually in Southern California. And then, they have family network in Taiwan. And then, they have other social networks, and then they maintain through various ways, and then in Malaysia. And so it was actually quite interesting to see how a minority, especially, minority who live on the margin of both Chinese society and Muslim society, and to sort of, travel such broad territory and then still remain quite resilient. And this is something that I really, really benefited from. And then I've been inspired actually by that kind of resilience in this particular community.
Great, thank you. Thank you for sharing with us all these anecdotes. They are incredibly interesting and tells us how you guys, now leading scholars of the field, get into the study at the beginning. And since we only have a few minutes left, I'll ask some of the questions from the audience. Our young audience are curious to know, as university professors, museum curators, and leading scholars of the field, how are you going to guide your students or proteges and visitors to your particular field to navigate the complex and rich Sino-Islamic interactions? What kind of advice you would give to young aspiring students and scholars? Anyone
Aziz,
would
please.
take?
I am waiting for other people to start. Yeah.
You please.
Dr. Ding?
I think Zabi Aziz is the first
Well,
speaker.
I would give them two very small pieces of advice.
Okay.
Number one, not to study the history of Islam in China as a separate history. It is a history of China, for the good and for the bad. It is a history of China. It has to be always studied against, the broader context of the goings on in Chinese history. It is not a single unified trajectory. At the same time, it is not separate from the history of Islam in the Islamic world. Although, of course, then usually in the past there were periods of not all the time there was direct connections, but the goings on in the Islamic world always somehow resonated, in the history of Chinese Islam. And I think we heard it a lot from Professor Ding. For example, the area of history of Sufism in China always reflected changes in the history of Sufism in outside China. The most important thing, I believe, is that our mission today is to remind everyone, that even if people in China are small minorities, they sometimes make significant contributions. People used to ask me, why do you study this? There are only few million people. Few million Muslims in China. But I say, yeah, but behind them, there's a very, very long world, very big world, okay, that its impact on China is huge. For instance, people studied the history of Jesuits in China. Jesuits were few hundreds, even few tens, but there is a very, very long body of knowledge about the Jesuits, precisely because Europe was standing behind. Okay, so it's the same thing. Okay, we need to and that point is very, very important to remember at all times, no matter what area of the history of Islam in China we're studying, whether it's astronomy in the Yuan or contemporary trade.
Dr. André, for the students or other visitors who visit your the Abu Dhabi Louvre, especially the exhibitions on China-Islamic interactions, how would you like to guide them?
Yeah, very interesting question. Actually, the way Sino-Islamic studies can be seen and shown into a museum is very interesting, problematic for a curator and for a museum. And in a more general way, since in the Louvre Abu Dhabi, we are mainly showing the interactions between civilization, and this is a very exciting project doing that also for the Sino-Islamic relations. And it turns out that this is precisely the perspective that is adopted into the narration and the presentation of the works at the Louvre Abu Dhabi, the way we discussed around this relationship today. And rather than focusing the narrative on the large political or national entities which may be juxtaposed from room to room into the museum, our way of addressing the visitors is that we are presenting the artworks along together as we want to explain and to give to the visitors the cross-cultural taste of it. So we group the artworks around the thematics that are common to different civilizations. Artworks are presenting co-visibility, which is sometimes very challenging for curators, since the artworks have sometimes very difficult conditions that need to be maintained into the galleries. But the idea is that we are educating and we are guiding the visitor's gaze in using that way, and basically this is the idea of tolerance and respect between civilizations that we want to give and to give to the visitors actually. And this is an exercise which is very convincing, and we say that about ceramics, but there are other examples which are very important for the history of the Gulf. In particular, I'm thinking about the theme of the frankincense, which was a good traded for a very, very long time, historical times on these trade routes. And we have a very interesting showcase, for example, which is bringing together two spherical incense burners, very similar to those which were found in the Famense temple, not so far from Lanzhou, close to Xi'an, more precisely. And we have these incense burners, and we'll display along to that one incense burner from the 13th century, which was made in Syria, so very far away from China, but which were copied actually from Chinese artworks later on. So we are bringing this story, these different stories together into our galleries. Other actions that we are implementing in the Louvre Abu Dhabi around our presentations. It's actually the organization of special events dealing with the art of those two civilizations and allowing specific in-depth studies of Chinese and Islamic cultures. I will keep the surprise. I will not reveal everything today, but I hope to see you soon and and we'll reveal when exactly, but it will be early in the autumn. We'll have exceptional events around the theme of Sino-Islamic relations that will be organized in the Louvre Abu Dhabi. I hope having the opportunity of seeing you there at the time.
Certainly. Last piece of words from Yuting or Dr. Ding to our aspiring young audience.
Okay. Since no more time left, I just give my young students and young scholars one simple advice, that to read books on Islam, Islamic culture and civilization objectively. So it is my request. Then respect it and admire its achievement for humanity. And for Chinese scholars and students, I advise to read more Arabic books or English book, since we don't have very good book on the topic in Chinese. So I advise them to read English or Arabic book. This is my simple advice.
Just to add one more thing, I think, especially since I come from a sociological background, and I've always actually considered religion as a lived experience. So to study Islam in China, Chinese Muslims, and then it is also a process to get to know people, individuals who are in different fields of work and then different professions. As a female researcher, I've had actually great access to women to really sort of build friendship and then a rapport with them. And that has really, really benefited my research. And so wherever you come from, I think for students, whichever discipline you're from, and it's actually, it's very, very useful and beneficial to get to know the research subject. And so not just speaking from a sociological training as a sociologist of religion. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, dear panelists and moderator, for your participation, for your time, and for your precious advice. I believe that they will be very helpful for our younger scholars who are planning to pursue this field. And now we are reaching the end of the session, the panel,